The valet took my keys without looking at me twice. That was fine. I was used to it. The Whitmore Club sat at the end of a long oak-lined drive, the kind of place that polished its reputation the same way it polished its flaws, obsessively, invisibly, and at great expense. I'd been here exactly once before, for my brother Caleb's engagement party 8 years ago. Back then, I'd been a surgical resident running on 4 hours of sleep and lukewarm hospital cafeteria coffee. I'd worn the wrong dress, said the wrong things about the wrong topics, and driven home at midnight to scrub into a 12-hour shift. Tonight I wore the right dress. I just wasn't sure that was going to be enough. The event coordinator intercepted me at the entrance with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you with the catering service?" she asked. "Check-in for vendors is around the side." I looked at her. I kept my face entirely still. "I'm a guest," I said. "My father is the guest of honor." She blinked. "Oh," a pause. "I'm so sorry," I thought. She gestured vaguely at my dress, at me, at the air between us. I didn't help her finish the sentence. I smiled the way I smile at the beginning of difficult conversations and walked past her into the lobby. The room smelled like gardenias and old money. Around 60 guests moved through the space in slow, comfortable clusters. My father's former colleagues from the insurance firm, neighbours from the subdivision he'd lived in for 30 years, Caleb's business contacts, who always seemed to materialise wherever Caleb happened to be. The centrepiece banner stretched across the back wall in gold lettering. "Congratulations on 35 years, Robert." My father stood near it, laughing at something a man in a golf shirt had just said, his hand resting on Caleb's shoulder like punctuation on a sentence he'd been writing his whole life. I picked up a glass of water from a passing tray and found an empty seat near the window. It took less than 10 minutes before I heard it. I wasn't meant to. I'd drifted a few steps closer to the bar area when one of my father's old colleagues, a man I vaguely recognised from a Christmas party sometime in the 90s, leaned toward my father with a lowered voice that carried anyway. "And your daughter, what does she do these days?" My father's answer came easily, comfortably, the way someone shrugs off a question they find mildly tedious. "Medicine. She checks hearts or something at a hospital in DC. A beat. Nothing like what Caleb's doing. You know, Caleb just closed the deal on the Riverside complex. 240 units. We're talking $160 million. The man nodded, already turning back toward Caleb. I took a slow sip of water. "She checks hearts or something." I thought about the Tuesday 3 weeks ago, when I'd been in the OR for 11 consecutive hours, repairing an aortic dissection on a 28-year-old Army Ranger who'd been told by 2 other surgeons that the window had closed. I thought about the call I got at 2 a.m. last February that had me on a military transport plane to Germany by 6 in the morning, operating in a trauma bay at Landstuhl, while someone held a flashlight over my hands because 2 ceiling panels had burned out. I thought about the 2,300-page consultation report I'd submitted to the Department of Defense the previous spring, the one that restructured emergency triage protocols across 7 military hospitals in 3 countries. She checks hearts or something. I found my seat at the table they'd assigned me without asking. It was near the emergency exit, slightly separated from the main cluster, next to a couple I didn't recognise who seemed equally uncertain why they were sitting there. My place card was present, at least. My name, though whoever had typed it had spelled it Happer, 1R, which felt like a small and perfect metaphor for the evening ahead. When the slideshow began, I counted the photos out of habit. Counting is how I make information legible to myself. I do it with data, with patience, with situations I'm trying to understand. 53 photos. The first 30 or so covered my father's career milestones, Caleb's childhood, Caleb's adolescence, Caleb's first real estate venture at 19 when he'd flipped a condo in Arlington, and my father had framed the closing documents and hung them in the study. There were photos of Caleb's daughter's first birthday, Caleb at a ribbon-cutting ceremony outside a building with his name on a placard. I appeared in 2, both from before I turned 16. In one, I was standing behind Caleb at Thanksgiving, half cropped out of the frame. In the other, I was looking off to the side at something the camera hadn't caught. I couldn't remember what. 53 photos too. The woman at the next table whispered to the man beside her, "Is that the daughter?" He squinted at the screen. I thought he only had the one kid. I kept my eyes on the projector. After the slideshow ended, my niece appeared beside my chair. She was 7, maybe 8, with the kind of fearless bluntness that only children and very secure adults are capable of. She studied me for a moment with her mother's eyes and her father's chin, and then she said loudly and with complete confidence, Are you the one who fixes hearts? Yes, I said. Are you a nurse? No, I said. I'm a surgeon. She seemed to file this away before adding, Daddy says you work hard, but it's not really the kind of job people talk about at parties. He says it's more of a background thing. She tilted her head. He told Grandpa, you're shy about it. I looked at this child for a long moment. Your daddy's right that I don't talk about it much, I said carefully. But the people who need the work know where to find me. She accepted this with a 7-year-old's pragmatism and ran off toward the dessert station, pink sneakers flashing under the tablecloths. I sat very still for a moment, not because I needed to collect myself, but because what she'd said was the kind of thing that settles into the room and doesn't lift, not sharp, just present. Caleb found me an hour later, during the quiet gap between cocktails and dinner. He was in full social mode. Navy suit, practiced ease, that particular brand of confidence that develops in people who have never been the least important person in any room they've entered. Hey, he said, glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it. He glanced around to make sure he was visible to the people he needed to be visible to, then lowered his voice slightly. Listen, there's a guy from Meridian Capital at table 6. I mentioned you work with the military medical program. His daughter is applying to the Walter Reed Fellowship program. I figured maybe you could say hello, put in a word. I looked at him steadily. You told him I work with the program.
Yeah.
The consulting stuff, the DoD thing. Caleb, I restructured emergency triage protocols for 7 military hospitals. That's not a consulting thing, that's what I do. He exhaled slowly through his nose. I know what you do, I just mean it's hard to explain in 30 seconds at a cocktail party. You've explained Riverside Crossing to 11 people in the last hour. His smile went flat at the edges. That's different. Why? He studied me the way he studied things that required more effort than he intended to give them, then stepped back. Just be nice to the guy if you get a chance, he said, and moved toward the bar. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. My mother appeared 20 minutes later, near the alcove outside the restrooms. She wore the expression she used when managing something she'd rather not name directly. Soft eyes, careful tone, the smile that was half warmth and half request. Sweetheart, she said, are you enjoying yourself? I'm here, I said, I've been here. She touched my arm. You seem somewhere else. I just want to check in. She paused, searching for the phrasing she'd already worked out on the drive over. Most of the guests tonight are your father's world. Insurance people, real estate. They don't really have, she tilted her head slightly, context for your kind of work. The government involvement, the military programs. It can come across as very intense for a retirement dinner. I held her gaze. You want me to not mention what I do? I want the evening to go smoothly, she said. It's your father's night. I thought about Christmas 3 years ago, when I'd tried to tell her about the surgical fellowship grant I'd received, a $2.1 million federal award, the largest given to an individual cardiac researcher that cycle. She'd said, that's wonderful, honey, and turned the conversation to Caleb's new development in Bethesda within 60 seconds, not out of cruelty, out of habit. In the geography of her attention, certain territories had simply never been mapped. I won't bring it up, I said, but I'm not going to lie about it either. She squeezed my arm. That's all I'm asking. I watched her float back into the room, light and smooth, the way she always moved, as if no difficult conversation had occurred. I returned to my table and let the room move around me for a while. That's when I saw him. He was seated at the third table from the front, which I hadn't noticed during cocktails, because a floral arrangement the size of a small shrub had been blocking the sightline. He was in his early 70s, silver-haired, carrying himself the way people do when they've spent decades in rooms where the decisions actually matter. He was already looking at me when our eyes met, with the expression of someone who had placed a face precisely. I placed his at the same moment. General Whitfield, retired, 31 years of service, culminating as Deputy Surgeon General of the Army. I had operated on him 16 months ago, emergency bypass surgery following a cardiac event at a symposium in Bethesda. He'd asked me afterward, in recovery, how I'd managed a particular complication in the second hour. I'd told him in technical detail, and he'd listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that information doesn't care about the rank of the person delivering it. He rose from his chair. I watched him cross the room toward me, past 2 tables, past my father who turned to look, past Caleb who clocked the generals bearing the way he clocked anything that signalled authority. He stopped in front of me and extended his hand. Dr. Nash, he said, I had no idea you'd be here tonight. The room shifted. Not dramatically, just that quiet, collective recalibration that happens when someone who registers as important speaks and the rest of the room recalibrates around the sound. General Whitfield. I stood and took his hand. I read about the Veterans Health Initiative in January. The foundation work is remarkable. We built it on the protocol frameworks from your DoD report, he said. Directly, without performance, the way someone states something they consider simply true. Your cardiac triage standards are now running across 4 theatre hospitals. We've seen measurable outcomes in field survival rates. Real numbers, he paused. Your father is a fortunate man, having someone doing that kind of work in his family. He nodded toward my father as he said it. My father was not laughing anymore. General Whitfield returned to his table. I sat back down and picked up my fork. Around me, the room began to move differently. Someone near the front had their phone out. I watched them type, watched their expression change from casual curiosity to something that looked like recalibration. The woman beside them leaned in, looked up, looked at me. Is she on the Surgeon General's advisory committee? The woman said. Not quite quietly enough. She was General Whitfield's daughter, I would later learn, a health reporter for the Post. She'd apparently been trying to secure an interview with the chair of the new Military Cardiac Protocol Initiative for 3 months. There was a piece this morning about the committee announcement. She held her phone screen out to the man beside her. He leaned in, then looked up at me. She designed the emergency cardiac protocols they've been rolling out internationally. She continued, louder now, the way people speak when they've found something worth saying. The field hospital standard. I have been trying to reach you. More phones came out. The murmur spread the way fire spreads when there's been enough dry air for long enough. My father stood at the edge of the main table, champagne glass raised halfway. His toast caught somewhere between his notes and the new shape of the room. He looked across the space at me. I met his eyes without expression. His arm lowered slowly until the glass was at his side. Caleb had stopped talking to whoever he'd been talking to. A woman I had never met crossed the room toward me and gripped the back of my chair with both hands. Her son, she said, had been treated at Landstuhl 18 months ago after a training accident. The attending physician there had told her that the cardiac guidelines they'd used were new, changed just that year. The woman's voice had a slight tremor in it that she didn't try to smooth out. Thank you, she said. I didn't know your name, but thank you. I told her I was glad her son was well. General Whitfield raised his glass from across the room. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't a toast. It was a correction. I lifted mine in return. My father delivered his toast. It was shorter than he'd planned. He said Caleb's name 4 times and mine once, at the very end. We're proud of everything our kids have built. He said it without looking directly at me, which told me he understood it wasn't enough. He understood the room understood it wasn't enough. I didn't stay past dessert. I didn't need to. The evening had already said what needed saying, and none of it had required me to raise my voice or lose my composure. I said good night to General Whitfield. I said good night to the journalist, who followed me as far as the lobby and asked 2 questions before I smiled, and told her to reach out through the PR office at Walter Reed. I said good night to my niece, who had reappeared at my elbow as if conjured and announced, with the gravity of a major life decision, that she was now planning to be a heart surgeon. It's very hard, I told her. So, she said. I drove home with the radio off. The quiet in my car was the good kind. The kind that sits alongside you instead of pressing on you. The kind that comes after you set something down that you'd been holding so long you forgot it had weight. I was almost home when I thought of the voicemail. It had come in 3 days ago from a number I hadn't immediately recognised. I'd been between rounds and had mentally flagged it to return later and then simply hadn't. I plugged my phone in at a red light and let it play. The voice was the Director of Communications at Walter Reed. Professional, warm, with a careful apology layered underneath the pleasantries. She said they had been attempting to reach me for approximately 6 months. They had initially made contact through a family member listed in my emergency contact file, and that family member had indicated I was not in a position to accept public recognition at that time and preferred the matter to be kept private. The hospital had, of course, respected that. But they were calling once more directly. The cardiac care wing that had opened in January. She described it in detail I didn't need because I already knew the wing. Had walked through it during the commissioning visit. Had seen the temporary placard above the door. Was going to be formally named in honour of contributions to military cardiac medicine. They wanted my permission to dedicate the plaque. She hoped I would consider it. A family member. I sat in my parked car outside my building and played the message a second time. 6 months ago, someone had told Walter Reed I didn't want recognition, someone with access to my emergency contact file, someone who had answered a call on my behalf, declined on my behalf, and then never mentioned any of it to me. I sat with this for a long time. Not in anger, though anger would have been the simpler response. What I felt was something quieter and more final. The last piece of a shape I'd been tracing for years clicking into place. Clean and complete and impossible to unsee. They hadn't kept me small because they were embarrassed. They'd kept me small because my presence at full size changed the picture. It complicated the narrative they'd been building since Caleb's first ribbon cutting. It asked something of people. Required them to explain why the daughter who fixed hearts in forward operating environments hadn't been in a single family photo from the last 15 years. Why her name never came up at dinner. Why the protocols now stamped with her work across 7 military hospitals had been reduced to she checks hearts or something. The plaque was easier to manage if I stayed hidden enough not to need one. I called the director of communications the next morning and gave my permission. Then I opened the keynote speech I'd been drafting for the Women in Medicine Leadership Forum, a conference that had invited me 3 times before I finally said yes. I'd been stuck on the opening for 2 weeks, convinced I needed a statistic, a citation, something professionally airtight. I deleted what I had. I typed. The most dangerous kind of invisibility is the kind that comes wrapped in love. I looked at this sentence for a while. Then I started to write, really write, for the first time in years, not for a grant committee or a medical journal or a DoD review board, for the room I hadn't been in yet, where someone was sitting at a table assigned without asking, watching a slideshow that didn't include them, quietly deciding whether their work counted if the people who raised them didn't acknowledge it. I wrote about the OR at 2 a.m, about the flashlight in Germany, about the place card that spelled my name wrong, and the little girl who said her father told her my work was a background thing, about what it costs to stay quiet in order to keep a peace that was never yours to keep. I wrote for a long time. The city outside my window went dark and then started to come back, the early blue of a morning that hadn't committed to anything yet. What I'd spent years waiting for, their version of acknowledgement, their inclusion, a place in the slideshow. I wasn't going to wait for any more. I understood now that what I'd been asking them to give me was something they had decided quietly and deliberately to withhold. Not out of forgetfulness. Out of design. The design was theirs. The work was mine. And the work had been speaking all along, in hospitals on 3 continents, in recovery rooms where people who almost didn't make it woke up and did. In every place they'd never thought to look because they'd decided in advance that there was nothing there worth finding. I closed the document, I made coffee, I stood at my window and watched the city pull itself together in the grey morning light. I didn't need them to see me. I didn't need the room full of guests to have turned toward me, though they did. I didn't need General Whitfield to stand, though he had. I didn't need my name announced or my title scrolled across a screen, or a plaque on a wall in a hospital they'd never visit. What I needed, it turned out, was simply to stop making myself smaller than the work. That was it. That was the whole thing. I poured my coffee and sat down and opened the speech again and kept going. There was more to say. There was so much more to say, and for the first time in longer than I could account for, I was interested in saying any of it quietly.